Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. Recently, the Justice Department issued two reports. One dealt with Darren Wilson. The other report dealt with the Ferguson Police Department. And I'm going to take some time to summarize the reports and to analyze the reports and to just share my thoughts about these two reports. So the first report that I will discuss is the Darren Wilson report. In that report, the Justice Department concluded that they could not disprove Darren Wilson's stated subjective belief that he feared for his safety. In that report, they state that Mike Brown reached inside of the police officer's vehicle. In that report, they state that Mike Brown punched Darren Wilson. In the report, they state that there was a struggle over the gun. That after Mike Brown punched the officer, Darren Wilson began to reach for his gun. They state that there was no other non-lethal option available to him at that time. So he reached for his gun. There was a struggle over the gun, and that a shot was fired. Mike Brown was hit in the hand. And they've reached this conclusion based on the physical evidence. They say that there was a bullet that confirms that there was a struggle, a bullet inside of the car close to Darren Wilson's lap, and it confirms that there was some kind of struggle over the gun in the car. Also, Mike Brown's DNA was found inside of the vehicle. His blood was in the vehicle. And based on the wound to his hand, they were able to determine that his hand was within inches of the muzzle of the gun at the time that the shot was fired. And based on all of that, they are concluding that there was, in fact, a struggle over the gun. So that's one aspect of the report. They also stated that no witnesses corroborated Darren Wilson's story that there was a struggle over the gun. But as I said, the physical evidence, according to the Justice Department, confirms that there was, in fact, a struggle over the gun. In the report, they state that Mike Brown was not shot in the back. And we all understand this. We know this because the autopsy report was released some time ago, and it confirms that he was not, in fact, shot in the back. But it does not confirm that he wasn't shot from behind. And even the Justice Department's report states that they were unable to determine which direction Mike Brown was facing when he received the two wounds to his right arm. So he could have been running. And according to the witnesses, they say that he was running and then he stopped when he was shot from behind. And based on those statements, I would say that he probably was hitting his arm from behind. But the Justice Department doesn't make a commitment one way or the other. They indicate that they don't know what direction he was facing at the time. And this report states that no witnesses' accounts that could be relied upon prove that Mike Brown was actually running away from the vehicle. But the Justice Department concluded that Mike Brown turned around and came towards Darren Wilson. And they reached that conclusion based on bloodstained evidence and based on some witness statements confirming that that was the case. And the report states that Darren Wilson said that Mike Brown was reaching under his shirt towards his waistband at the time, right before Darren Wilson fired those fatal shots right before it. And basically, they are implying that Darren Wilson feared that Mike Brown may have a gun. And I just want to go back to one point that I mentioned before about Mike Brown reaching inside of the vehicle and punching Darren Wilson. As you will recall, Mike Brown's friend said that the contrary, in fact, occurred. He said that as they were walking down the street, the police officer pulled to the side and reached out of the vehicle window and grabbed Mike Brown around the neck. And so the Justice Department found that those statements were inconsistent with the physical evidence and the forensic evidence. And based on that, they said that essentially that those statements weren't credible. So back to what I was talking about. So as you all know, many witnesses said that Mike Brown had his hands up at the time of the shooting. But the Justice Department confirmed or concluded that those accounts do not support a prosecution. And they reached that conclusion based on three different reasons. The first reason is that they claim that those accounts are inconsistent with the physical evidence. The second reason is that they say that those accounts are inconsistent with the witness's prior statements. And the last reason is they state that many of the witnesses or some of the witnesses recanted their stories. And based on that, they concluded that those accounts do not support a prosecution. Now, I'm just going to share my thoughts about this report. I really find this report hard to believe for a couple of reasons. Number one, it is completely irrational for an unarmed person to actually reach inside a police officer's car. It makes no sense at all for someone to punch an officer without a provocation. It simply makes no sense at all. It makes no sense for an unarmed person to try to grab a police officer's gun. So just based on logic, I find that account to be very difficult to believe. I really do. And I understand that they reviewed the evidence and they reached their conclusion. I understand that they interviewed a lot of witnesses, but I still can't get my mind around that idea that some unarmed teenager is just going to reach inside a police officer's car, punch a police officer, try to grab the police officer's gun, and then after that person is shot, after he's shot, he's leaving the scene, and then all of a sudden he decides to turn around and reach towards his waistband and basically head in the direction of the police officer. That simply makes no sense to me. It's irrational to me. It's completely illogical. I don't understand why anybody in their right mind would do something like that. So it's very difficult for me to believe that story. And also in this report, they indicated that Mike Brown fell down after he was shot and that one of his hands was close to his waistband when he was on the ground. So they used that to confirm their account that Mike Brown was actually reaching towards his waistband at the time when the fatal shots occurred. And they say that there was no evidence that Mike Brown's hand was moved after he was shot or that his body was repositioned after he fell. That's their account. And again, I just find it hard to believe it. It makes no sense to me. Um, and, I'll never believe it. It's hard to believe that all those witnesses just made up a story out of thin air, that they all decided, collaborated and said, we're going to basically say that he had his hands up when he didn't have his hands up. You had many different witnesses say that. They went before the media and they made those statements. And I understand that it's one thing to make a statement um, on a news program, and it's quite another thing to make a statement before a court of law, or, to make a statement when you're facing intense questioning and interrogation. So I understand that. But again, it simply makes no sense. The story doesn't add up to me. And it just is another example of the shortcomings of this criminal justice system that we have in this country. Often, when these things happen, the Justice Department says they're going to do an investigation. They do an investigation, and then because of the way the laws are structured, or just because of the system, they eventually conclude that there was no wrongdoing, or there's no grounds for an indictment. And we have another situation where somebody gets away with killing another black man or boy. It happens over and over again. And it's just outrageous. It's like a modern day Emmett Till situation. Even though we're in the 21st century, still black life is completely worthless in this society. And this is just a reminder that you had a grand jury system that basically allowed that cop, that killer, to walk free. And now you have a Justice Department that basically co-signed that injustice. And it's outrageous. So now I'm going to move on and I'm going to discuss the Ferguson report. This report is really eye-opening. I mean, many of us had an idea about this discrimination that people face in Ferguson, but this report really crystallizes it. It makes it clear so the whole world can understand what type of discrimination African Americans face in Ferguson. The report points out that African Americans are 67% of the population. However, 93% of the arrests that were made in 2012 through 2014 were of African Americans. 85% of the traffic stops were African Americans. 90% of the citations were issued to African Americans. This report points out how whenever there are police dog biting incidents, all of the people who were bit by the police dogs were black during that same time period. Every time a person is arrested for resisting arrest, that person was black. And this is for the period of 2012 through 2014. And the report concludes that the disparities occur, at least in part, because of unlawful bias and stereotypes about black people. And the report cites examples of that prejudice, of that bias, of that racism, of that hatred. They cite examples of emails that city officials issued. They cite an email that depicted the President of the United States as a chimpanzee. They cite another email that equates black abortion with stopping crime. They basically imply that if black women abort their children, they are helping to prevent crime. Essentially, they are condoning genocide, basically. They also cite another email that depicts African women dancing bare-chested, and they titled that photo Michelle Obama's high school reunion. This is the mentality of the people in charge in Ferguson. This is the mentality of the people that have influence and power in Ferguson. It's truly a frightening thought. They cite a couple of glaring examples of police racism and police brutality. And a couple of them stand out, and I'll just talk about those. One involves a dispute that took place at an apartment building. The police received a call about an argument or a problem at an apartment building. They arrived at the apartment building and they asked a man some questions. And he basically said, "What have I done wrong? You don't have anything on me." And then the police officer basically tells him, "Nigger, I'll find something to arrest you for." And then this police officer bangs this man's head on a wall, slams his head into a wall, and then tells the man, "Don't pass out because I don't feel like carrying you out of here." This is the mentality of these police officers. This is the culture of the police in Ferguson. They cite another example of a 14-year-old unarmed teenage boy, a black boy, who was attacked. Police officers had a police dog bite this unarmed African American teenager. This is outrageous. This police report, or this report that the Justice Department issued about the Ferguson Police Department vindicates the protesters. This report basically explains why Ferguson exploded. All of the ingredients were there. The ingredients of police harassment, the ingredients of police brutality, the ingredients of injustice, of inequality, of humiliation and degradation were there. All that they needed was a spark to explode. And that spark was the killing of Mike Brown. When the people saw Mike Brown's body laying in the street for hours with the blood streaming down the street, when they saw the police treat this brother like he was roadkill, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That was the spark that ignited the powder keg. And that's why Ferguson burned. And that's why the people were marching and protesting and demonstrating. And this report confirms that their cause was righteous. See, even progressive administrations, so-called progressive administrations, so-called liberal administrations, they need pressure in order to affect change. And we have examples of this in history. It took the marchers, the demonstrators, the March on Washington, the March on Selma, in order to affect real change in this country, in order to make civil rights a reality in this country, in order to bring about the passage of the Civil Rights Act, in order to bring about the passage of the Voting Rights Act, it took agitation, protest, and struggle. And as a result of the struggle in Ferguson and the struggle around the country, the Justice Department conducted this investigation. Because believe me, if it wasn't for the struggle, if it wasn't for people marching and demonstrating, I doubt that they would have conducted an investigation. If they didn't hear the voice of the people demanding justice, there would have been no investigation. And that brings me to another point. And that is the point about the importance of voting. See, if Obama wasn't in the White House, it is unlikely that Eric Holder would be the Attorney General. And Eric Holder, he has made enforcing civil rights a top priority. Now imagine if Mitt Romney was the president. Do you really think that Mitt Romney would send the Attorney General to Ferguson to investigate? Do you really think he would have conducted such an investigation and issued such a powerful report about the Ferguson Police Department? I doubt it. So elections matter, people. And when you reflect upon the makeup of the Ferguson government and power structure, it is another example of how important elections are. Despite the fact that African Americans are 67% of the population, you have a white mayor in Ferguson. You have a white police chief in Ferguson. You have a virtually all-white police department in Ferguson. You have a predominantly white city council in Ferguson. You have a predominantly white school board in Ferguson. That's wrong. And the thing that's even more wrong than that is the apathy that exists in the community. If you don't vote, you don't count, you don't matter. You have surrendered your power. And the situation reminds me of apartheid South Africa, when black people were the majority in South Africa, but they held no political power. The white people ran the government. The white people ran the police departments. The white people ruled. And the same is true of the American South during the 50s and 60s and earlier. You had predominantly black communities that were ruled by white people. And back then, we were denied the right to vote. We were subjected to literacy tests and poll taxes and terrorism. People were shot for trying to vote. People were lynched for trying to advocate for voting rights. That was the climate that we faced. And in apartheid South Africa, they were deprived of basic civil and human rights. Today, we have the right to vote as a result of the struggle of our ancestors, our grandparents, and our parents. We have the right to vote, but we voluntarily surrender that right. And that is a disgrace. If we want power, we need to be in positions of power and influence. If more people voted in Ferguson, you would have a black mayor in Ferguson. You would have a black police chief in Ferguson. You would have more black officers on the police force. And it's possible that you would even have a situation where there's less police brutality. There would probably be no Darren Wilson if black people had power in Ferguson. if they exercise their power in Ferguson. So we have to engage in various forms of struggle, whether that's struggle at the ballot box or struggle in the streets or struggle in the halls of government. We need to continue to push, to strive, and to fight for our human rights and human dignity.